After hours of non-stop driving, I couldn't keep going anymore. My back was killing me, and my eyes felt heavy, barely staying open. I figured the best thing to do was to pull over and get some rest. Luckily, I found an empty spot by the roadside, far from any town, but it looked safe enough. All I could hear were crickets and the wind rustling through the trees. It was the perfect setup to finally relax and try to sleep a bit. After setting up my bed, I crawled under the blankets, ready to crash. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but then I realized it was screaming. It wasn't normal. It sounded human, desperate. My senses kicked in, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what was going on outside. My mind immediately went to the possibility of an accident. Maybe someone was hurt and needed help. I felt like I had to check it out, so, even though I had a weird feeling about it, I opened the trailer door and stepped outside to see if I could find anyone. The night was pitch black, and the only light I had was from my dim flashlight. I walked a few steps away from the trailer, following the sound of the screams that seemed to be coming from up ahead, near a car parked on the side of the road, completely dark. As I got closer, I could make out two figures standing beside the vehicle. One of them was holding a powerful flashlight, and as soon as I got near, he turned it directly at my face, almost blinding me. I froze for a second, disoriented, trying to process what was happening. The screaming had stopped. That's when I realized they'd noticed me and were staring back. Suddenly, one of them started walking toward me while the other seemed to whisper something to him. A wave of pure fear hit me like a punch, and my body just went into survival mode. I barely had time to think, but my gut was telling me to run. So that's exactly what I did. I turned around and sprinted back to the trailer, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear footsteps behind me and see their flashlight bouncing around in the darkness. They were actually chasing me. Fear completely took over. I could feel the rough ground under my feet, adrenaline flooding my system, making me run faster. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to know how close they were. I reached the trailer almost tripping over myself and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it as fast as I could. I scrambled to the driver's seat, hands shaking like crazy, and turned the engine on. My foot hit the gas hard, and as the trailer sped off, I glanced in the rearview mirror. One of them was standing in the middle of the road, flashlight still pointed at me. It was like he wanted me to see him, to remember him. That image burned itself into my memory as I drove away, faster and faster. The road was empty, and the trailer shook with the speed as I tried to get as far away as possible from that spot. My mind was racing, going over every detail, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. Who were those guys? Why were they out there, in the middle of nowhere, with a dead car and screaming? And why did they chase me? The more I thought about it, the more confused I got. But one thing I knew for sure, something was seriously wrong, and I was glad to be out of there. After a few minutes of pure panic, I finally saw the lights of a town up ahead. I slowed down, trying to calm myself, but I was still shaking all over. I pulled into a gas station by the road and stepped out to catch my breath. It was still early, and the place was practically empty, just the gas attendant eyeing me from a distance. I tried to act casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood there for a few minutes, looking around, but everything was silent. The town looked quiet, and the only sounds were a few cars passing by on the highway. Even so, I couldn't calm down. That image of the guy standing in the road with his flashlight pointed right at me was still stuck in my head. It felt like he was burned into my memory, like he had some kind of purpose I couldn't figure out. A shiver ran up my spine just thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't run back to the trailer in time. I got back inside and stayed there until the sun started to come up, trying to sleep, but every little sound put me on edge. When daylight finally broke, I felt a weird sense of relief, like somehow the light would keep me safe. Before heading out, I stopped by the local police station and gave them a quick rundown of what happened. The officers didn't seem too interested. They just shrugged it off, saying it was probably local weirdos, but I knew there was more to it than that. I drove off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just escaped something I'll never fully understand. Since that night, every time I pass through a remote area, I get this tight feeling in my gut, remembering that night. The truth is, I'll never know what those guys were doing out there, and honestly, I don't think I want to. When I first heard about this urban camping event organized by a local community group, I thought it would be a fun way to break out of my usual routine. I didn't know many people there, but the idea of camping right in the heart of the city, in a green space with a bunch of friendly folks, sounded unique. There were families, couples, and a few people, like me, who had come solo. The atmosphere was relaxed. Everyone was sharing stories, lanterns lit up the tents, and there was that simple smell of campfire food that you only get outdoors. I was enjoying it so much that I even thought about joining similar events in the future. Then, around 11 at night, while some were already heading to bed, one of the organizers, a guy I'd only seen in passing before, came over to talk to me. He seemed friendly enough, the kind of person everyone greets but doesn't really know. He mentioned there was an amazing view nearby, a secret spot that only a few people knew about. The idea of exploring a hidden spot in the city with someone from the group seemed cool, and he sounded so enthusiastic that I agreed. He led the way, and we followed a semi-clear path that quickly moved us away from the camp's lights. I kept track of the path at first, but as we got farther, the sounds of the camp and the tent lights started fading into the background. As we walked, the vibe began to shift. I can't quite explain it, but the silence around us felt heavier with each step. The path kept getting darker, and the only light was from his flashlight, which he was holding up ahead. The strangest part was that, the further we went, the quieter he got. He just kept saying we're almost there, but in this low, almost nervous tone. I tried to brush it off, but I could feel a pit of unease growing inside me. I started to regret following someone I barely knew into such an isolated area. At that point, my gut was screaming that something was off. I stopped and said I thought it might be better to head back, that it was getting late and I wanted to rest. But he didn't take it well. He stopped too, but not to listen. He grabbed my arm, firmly, in a way that was anything but casual. This wasn't a friendly hold. It felt controlling. I asked him what he was doing, and he just muttered that it was a bad idea to head back now, that it was dangerous to go alone. It didn't make sense. I knew the camp was just a short distance away, but suddenly it felt like I was a million miles from safety, and his grip was only getting tighter. I tried to stay calm, but it was hard to ignore the panic building up inside me. My breathing sped up, and that chill down my spine turned into full-blown fear. I tried once more firmly this time, to tell him I wanted to go back. I pulled at my arm, trying to get free, but he only held on tighter, like he was dead set on keeping me there. For a split second, I looked into his eyes, and there was something strange. This mix of nervousness and hesitation, like he was having some internal struggle about what to do next. That look sent chills through me, but it also made me realize he wasn't as in control as he seemed. In a sudden burst of instinct, I yanked my arm hard and managed to break free. Without thinking twice, I turned around and started walking fast, heading back toward the campsite. I knew running might trigger him to react even worse, so I forced myself to keep it steady. I could feel my feet moving quickly, and I could hear his heavier steps right behind me. The distance felt endless, and every step I took, it seemed like I was still too far from the lights and the familiar sounds of the camp. In the darkness and fear, all I could focus on was reaching the safety of other people as soon as possible. Each step I took seemed to make him pick up his pace too. I could feel his footsteps closing in, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. At one point, I heard him muttering something, but I couldn't make out what it was, and it only made my fear spike even higher. He didn't look anything like the laid-back guy I'd seen earlier in the night. He seemed like a completely different person. Finally, I saw a small gap between the trees where I could make out the dim lights of the tents. That sight gave me a surge of strength I didn't even know I had. I rushed toward the lights, not daring to look back. When I finally got close enough to see the first tints, my heart was pounding, but I felt this huge wave of relief as I started hearing other people's voices again. I kept walking toward the group, trying not to show my panic, but my mind was racing. I wanted to tell someone what had happened, but I couldn't even process it myself. Before I joined the others, I turned back to check, and there he was, just standing at the edge of the dark area, staring. He stayed there for a few seconds, then disappeared back into the trees, like nothing had ever happened. When I got back to the campsite, I tried to act normal, but the feeling that he was still watching me wouldn't go away. My whole body was tense, and my breathing was still rapid, like I was still running. I stayed close to the group, pretending to listen to the conversations, but I couldn't get that moment out of my head. It all felt so surreal. I wondered if anyone else had gone through something similar with him, or if it was just me. But looking around, everyone seemed so carefree that I felt weird even thinking about bringing it up. The night dragged on, but I just couldn't relax. After what happened, I knew there was no way I'd be sleeping there, no matter how hard I tried. I waited until the first sign that someone was awake, and I started packing up my things to leave as fast as I could. When one of the other organizers asked if everything was okay, I just nodded, not wanting to explain. To this day, I still can't fully make sense of what went down that night. All I know is, since then, I've avoided any events like that, especially with people I barely know. Maybe it was just a scare, but the sense of real danger was so intense that I can remember every second of that walk. When I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains, all I had in mind was peace, quiet, and the chance to find some rare plants for my research. I'm a botanist, and after months stuck in the lab and endless meetings, this felt like the perfect escape to unwind and gather some samples I needed. The place was super remote, just a rough dirt road surrounded by trees leading up to it. The cabin was simple, but it had everything I needed. My plan was to spend a few nights there, explore the area during the day, take some notes, and head back with enough material to keep my project going. On the first night, after unpacking my gear and getting a quick look around, I decided to take a walk around the property before it got too dark. The sun was setting, and everything around the cabin was getting quieter, except for the sound of a river nearby. As I got closer to the river, I noticed something that made me uneasy. There was a guy standing by the water, just staring at the stream. He didn't have any camping gear or anything with him, nothing that'd make it look like he was there for a night out in nature. He was just standing there, almost frozen, not seeming to notice me, until I accidentally stepped on a dry leaf, making a loud crack under my foot. As soon as he heard that, he slowly turned his head toward me, like he'd been waiting for it. His face was half in the shadow of the trees, but I could see this strange expression, a mix of curiosity and something I couldn't quite place. He started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, and my first reaction was to act like I hadn't noticed. I turned around, ready to head back to the cabin, but he called out to me with this tone that sounded more like an interrogation than a conversation. "What are you doing here alone?" There was something about his voice, a kind of familiarity with the place, that made me feel even more uneasy. I gave him a short answer, just saying I was there to collect some plants. But then he started asking more personal questions, like if I was staying up at the cabin and if anyone knew I was there. My gut told me not to answer, but I didn't want to provoke him either, so I tried to brush off his questions, keeping my answers vague. Then, he said something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned the exact time I'd arrived at the cabin, and I hadn't told him a thing. How did he know that? I hadn't seen a single person on my way up, and it freaked me out that someone might have been watching me. I started feeling exposed, like he was trying to figure out every move I'd made since I got there. And he kept coming closer, close enough that I could see his eyes locked on mine, like he was studying every detail of my face. "You're alone in that cabin, right?" he asked again, pushing, each word making me feel more trapped. I was scrambling for something to say, but couldn't think clearly. I took a deep breath and tried to keep a neutral tone, telling him that, yeah, I was there alone, but I was always checking in with colleagues online. It was a lie, obviously, because there was no signal out there, but I hoped it would make him back off a bit. He gave a little laugh, like he knew I was lying. Oh yeah? I thought this place didn't get any signal, he replied, still smiling, but in a way that seemed to mock my attempt to protect myself. My discomfort was only getting worse, and I knew I had to get away from him somehow. I started walking backwards, keeping the conversation as light as I could, while trying to figure out how to get back to the cabin without looking terrified. But he matched my steps, moving closer every time I tried to put some distance between us. Every second around him made the air feel heavier, and all I could think about was getting out without setting him off. Finally, I said I needed to head back to the cabin to finish some work before it got dark. I tried to sound casual, but he could tell I was in a hurry and made a comment about how the silence of the mountains was best enjoyed alone. For some reason, that line sent chills down my spine, like he was hinting at something. I kept backing away, trying to keep my expression calm, but my mind was racing. The idea of running crossed my mind, but I knew that would just make things worse. Showing fear seemed like the last thing I wanted to do around him. I was almost at the small trail that led back to the cabin when he stopped, as if he'd lost interest for a moment. But just as I turned to head down the path, he said softly, "Head back to the cabin. Enjoy your last night." The way he said it, with that unsettling calm, made me freeze for a second. It felt like he somehow knew I'd be leaving soon, but I hadn't mentioned how long I was staying. In that moment, all I wanted was to run straight to my car and get out of there. But I knew that wasn't possible on that rough road without a plan. So, I turned onto the trail, trying to keep my pace steady, all while feeling his eyes following me. As I walked back, I could feel my skin prickling, this heavy feeling in my gut. His presence seemed to fade, but the sense that he was still watching me just wouldn't go away. When I got back to the cabin, I shut the door and stood there for a moment, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just a weird situation and I was overreacting. But when I looked out the window, I saw him in the distance, standing exactly where we'd parted ways. He was still there, completely still, just looking toward the cabin, almost like he was waiting. The sight was so out of place, and I felt trapped in a nightmare, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. I spent the next few minutes watching his every move, but he didn't budge. It was like he knew I was watching him, and he wanted me to feel uncomfortable. Trying to shake it off, I closed all the curtains and decided to distract myself with some work notes, hoping it would calm me down. But honestly, I couldn't stop thinking about everything he'd said, especially that line about enjoying my last night. The way he'd said it felt like some hidden threat, and I couldn't get it out of my head. My hands were sweating, and every creak of the cabins would made me jump. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. A few minutes later, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water to calm down, but as I passed the window, I couldn't resist taking another look outside. He was gone. The area around the river was empty, which should have been a relief, but it just made me even more nervous. I kept imagining he was hiding somewhere closer to the cabin, or maybe he'd really left. There was no way to be sure, and that uncertainty was gnawing at me. I just stood there, listening for any sound out of place, but everything was dead silent, like the whole mountain was holding its breath with me. When night finally settled in, I realized I wouldn't have peace until I made sure I was safe. I went around locking every door and window, but as I was doing that, I heard this faint creak on the back porch. It was barely audible, but just enough to put me on high alert again. I waited, listening, but the sound stopped. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I turned on every light in the cabin, hoping it'd scare off anything or anyone lurking outside. But the light only seemed to draw out shadows, and every time I looked out the windows, the feeling of being watched just got worse. I've always loved camping in isolated places, where all you hear is the sound of the ocean and the wind through the trees. Last weekend, I found the perfect spot, a nearly deserted beach that took a bit of a hike over rocks to reach. The first day was totally peaceful. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and spent the afternoon relaxing, just soaking in that quiet you only get in places like this. I was alone, and honestly, that was the best part. But in the middle of the afternoon, I noticed someone on the edge of the beach. A man, by himself, with no backpack or gear. He was just in regular clothes, stuff you'd wear in the city, but looking completely out of place out there. I thought it was a bit weird, but I decided to ignore it. Sometimes people go to these spots just to clear their heads, right? But the thing is, he didn't seem to be chilling out or enjoying the view. The guy kept pacing back and forth, like he was looking for something, or maybe waiting for someone. Every time I glanced his way, he was staring back at me. At first, I figured he was just as surprised as I was to find someone else on such a deserted beach. I tried to brush it off, but every time I caught a glimpse of him from the corner of my eye, he was still there, walking back and forth, almost like he was in some kind of trance. As the afternoon wore on and the sky started turning orange, he was still there. He never got close, but he also didn't leave. I was starting to feel uneasy, and no matter how much I tried to distract myself, he kept popping up in my field of vision. At one point, he just stopped, turned to face the ocean, and stood completely still, staring out at the horizon. I can't really explain it, but there was something seriously unsettling about it. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face in detail, but close enough that I could see his odd, slouched posture. Up until then, I tried to convince myself he was just a weird guy, but I was starting to question if staying there was even safe. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon and darkness took over, my anxiety went up a notch. I built a small fire near my tent, hoping the light would push away the bad vibes that had been creeping in. I was sitting there, trying to chill out, when I realized he'd gotten closer. Now, he was standing much nearer, just a few yards from the fire, watching me. I tried to act like I hadn't noticed, but it was impossible to ignore him. His every move seemed deliberately slow and bizarre, like he wanted me to see him. By this point, my heart was racing, but I stayed put, trying to play it cool and not let on how freaked out I was. I thought about saying something, maybe asking if he needed help or something like that, but the words just wouldn't come out. He kept standing there, totally still, staring at me with this weird expression. The fire cast strange shadows on his face, making his look even creepier. He seemed like he was in some sort of trance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was doing it on purpose, almost like he wanted to scare me. After a few minutes of that unbearable tension, he finally started moving, but not to leave. Instead, he circled around and began walking in slow, silent circles around my campsite, always watching me. I was frozen, trying to figure out what he was doing, but nothing made sense. I could hear his footsteps crushing the sand, the sound of rocks getting kicked aside, and his presence felt so heavy, it was like it was suffocating. That was the moment I realized I had to make a choice. Staying alone with this stranger lurking around wasn't looking like a smart option anymore. My first thought was to go into my tent, grab my flashlight and a few essentials, and just get out of there as fast as I could. But as I moved, I noticed he'd stopped walking. Now he was watching me again, but this time with a different expression, like he was about to make a move. I hesitated, feeling a chill run down my spine, unsure if running would make things worse. Deep down, I knew that if I stayed, I probably wouldn't get any sleep with him lurking around. With no other choice, I started packing up my stuff as quickly as I could, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. He must have realized I was about to leave because he took a few steps back, but not enough to make me feel at ease. Once I had all my things together, he was closer to the trail I'd need to take to get off the beach, meaning I'd have to pass pretty close to him to leave. I took a deep breath and, flashlight in hand, started walking. As I walked, he just stood there, watching me go, which only made me more nervous. The distance between us kept shrinking with each step, and I tried hard not to look directly at him, but it was impossible to ignore his intense stare. When I finally passed him, just a few feet away, I got a better look at his face. He looked way more worn out than I'd first thought, with this blank, almost lifeless expression. He didn't say anything, just followed me with his eyes, like he was waiting for something. Once I got past him and kept moving, the sound of my footsteps was replaced by absolute silence. I glanced back one last time, expecting to see him still standing there, but he had already disappeared. The relief I thought I'd feel was instead replaced by an even bigger sense of dread because I hadn't heard a single sound. He was just gone, like he'd never been there at all. I kept walking along the dark trail, doing my best to steady my breathing and ignore the feeling that he might be right behind me. Every sound around me felt louder, and I couldn't shake the thought that he was somewhere nearby, still watching. When I finally made it back to the road, I was completely drained, both physically and mentally. I checked my phone for the time and realized it wasn't even that late. The night had felt like it dragged on for hours, but it wasn't even 9 p.m. Even after getting home, the unease stayed with me. I couldn't sleep that night, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, staring at me. To this day, I still can't explain what happened or what that guy wanted. I've never been back to that beach, and every time I think about camping alone again, the memory of his face makes me change my mind.